This project, I am working on Fisher 400 paper. This is on from proartpanels.com, and it comes pre-mounted. So I'm not, you can see it, it's a hard board. It's not moving as I work. I don't have to tape it down. Really, really nice to work on. If you like powdered blend, wow, I can't say powdered blender, or even if you work in pastels, this is the same paper I'm going to use for my pastel project coming up. Think those are words I never thought you guys would hear me say. But this one, I've drawn everything out with a regular graphite pencil. I think I used a 4H, and you can see it looks dark. It looks like I used a B pencil. I didn't. This is a light pencil just with sanded paper, graphite pencil, whatever sticks to it really, really well. Now, if you don't have powder blender, I still recommend give sanded paper a try. You can still kind of blend it without. You can also use OMS on it, but it's a really interesting paper to work on. I thought I would hate it. When I was told that this was what you want to use, it was one of the best choices for powder blender. I was pretty hesitant because thinking that's way too much tooth. I'm not going to like that. I absolutely love it, and I don't have any trouble getting the detail that I want still on top of it. I thought that was going to be a real problem. Now, with Powder Blender, when you're doing the background like this, you can see I'm being really, really loose, holding the pencil to the side. And actually, I started burning through my pencil so fast because you're getting so much coverage so quickly. I started taking a razor blade because you don't need your pencils to be sharp like you normally would using watercolor paper. So I started taking or not a razor blade, but an X-Acto knife and using that to sharpen the pencil because I was able to get more lead exposed since I didn't need it sharp. And you can make a sharp pencil with an X-Acto knife, but I'm pretty sure I'd cut off fingers. So that isn't a method I normally would use. But for this, because I wasn't trying to get a sharp point, I found that during the live stream, which is where this was originally recorded, I did use the pencil sharpener just because it would make things go faster. But like after the live stream, I just started sharpening with that X-Acto knife, and it did make my pencils last a lot longer. You can see I'm using my hands a lot as I talk here because this was footage from the live stream, but I wanted to turn this into a Patreon video too with a good camera because I think that it will be more helpful for you guys if you can really see where the project is soft and smooth versus where it's kind of rough and that it's normal for it to be rough. Because with the live streams, the webcams that I'm using, they smooth things out too much. And so you can't, and there's no way for me to fix that without upgrading equipment, which hopefully in the near future. But for now, they smooth things out too much. So I really wanted you guys to be able to see the actual footage. So that is what we are doing here. As I go around the edges, I do want to keep this semi-clean, and the pencil I'm using here I think is dark sepia. I did a lot of different layers with warm and cool grays depending on the area. The left or right side, I used more cool grays, whereas the left side I went with the warmer grays. But I'm just blocking it in. I'm scribbling. I don't have to worry about pencil strokes like I normally would. All of this will blend out completely. I clearly need more coffee, but I don't have to worry about any of that right now. I can go any direction I want. I mean, it really is just scribbling, but I outline my subject first to try to keep those edges fairly clean. When I blend, I'm going to lose some of those lines. It's not a big deal. Now with Powder Blender too, and if you don't use the texture fixative spray in between layers, where you have not sprayed that, you will be able to erase quite a bit of the Powder Blender. It does come up pretty well, so you can still see what's underneath. But once you've sprayed that texture fixative, that's it. You're not really going to get much in the way of erasing. But the way that this works, and there's so much tooth, you can just draw right over it. So if there's an area like her finger, I could have completely shaded over one of her fingers, and when I go over it with the lighter pencils, you won't even be able to tell it's up against the dark background. So here's where I'm blending out with Powder Blender. You don't need a ton of it on your blending tool. I'm using soft tools. I really, really like these, especially for larger areas. I've tried the smaller sponges, the handheld sponges, or actually I should say larger sponges, but the handheld ones for big areas, and I find that they just end up, every time I've tried them, they just wipe up too much product off the paper, so those don't work as well. But I'm able to keep a light enough hand that these soft tools work really, really well. Powder Blender, if you get the kit from brushandpencil.com, they come with these they're like makeup or eyeshadow sponge applicators that people shouldn't really use for applying eyeshadow, but for whatever reason, that's what they're called. And I like them for small areas. You'll see me use those later on when I get into the portrait, not on this video, and onto the clothes next week. Actually, I may use them a little bit on the hair on this one, but for large areas like this, I do recommend pick up a set of those soft tools, and they're not terribly expensive. You can get a 4-pack with different types of tips, and then the sponge applicators to go over them. And when I change color, so like here, I'm blending with black. If I was going to switch over to her skin, I am going to switch the sponge. If it's to a color that's similar, I can just wipe the sponge tool off on a paper towel. But if I were going to a really light color like her skin, then I'm going to need to switch tools, or the sponge, I should say. And I don't want to push too hard here. I'm going to have some of my brush strokes, or sponge strokes, I guess, on this. It's not a big deal. Those are going to get covered in later layers. And this is why it is so, so important to have the texture fixative spray, because I have a lot of people ask, can I just use powder blender without that? Technically you can, but you're not going to be able to get the layering. You're not going to be able to seal it down, and using other fixatives that you would use for like pastels don't work well with this. There is a very, very big difference. And the texture fixative is meant for colored pencils, so you know it's archival, everything's going to be good there. But what it'll do is seal this down to an extent. It's not completely, it's not like putting a varnish over it where nothing will lift off, but it will seal enough of it down that you can put another layer on and it won't lift off your first layer. If you just keep layering on top of layer, like, you know, finish blending this out, add more pencil, blend that out, you end up just moving the product around and knocking a lot of it off. So I wouldn't be able to get this as dark as I ended up being able to. Now, I want to say, in order to get this as dark as what you're seeing in this stage of the finished, I guess it's not really a finished photo, but her hair, what we're going to get done today, the hair in the background, that I want to say I did maybe 3 or 4 layers on camera, and then I did another additional 6 off camera. So you won't see that additional 6, but it was repeating the exact same process over and over until I got it to this point. You can still see a little bit of that grittiness on some of this. If you wanted, or on the finished photo, if you wanted to smooth that out even more, you absolutely could. You just keep layering. You never hit a point where you can't keep adding additional layers because of that texture fixative. Each time you spray it, it's adding more tooth to the paper. So in my case, like the gray portion of the hair, that I ended up burnishing a bit and I flattened the tooth of the paper a bit too much, but I'll just spray the texture fixative over it because I've got to put green in that still, which makes no sense. I'll explain that in a minute. I've got to put green in that hair on the gray side still. Right now, if I were to do that, it's not going to stick. The pencils are just not going to stick. I've flattened it too much, but the texture fixative, that will bring the tooth back enough that I'm able to get those additional layers. Now for this piece, a friend of mine who is getting into design, he designed the dress. It's a Beetlejuice inspired dress, and he did a whole collaboration with a makeup artist, a hair stylist, a photographer, and who was the other? I'm missing someone from that crew. But there were a bunch of people involved in this, and this was the photo with that. So because this is a Beetlejuice inspired, I wanted it to have a little bit more of a hint of Beetlejuice. So part of her head, which if you follow me on Instagram, you've seen it at that stage already, but part of her head is going to be in black and white, and it fades into the color of her skin. And then of course the hair here, I'm going to put on the eye, her right eye, the left side here, that will have some of the purple that Beetlejuice had around his eye, the makeup they had on that character, and some green into the hair over the gray. Just a hint. It's not going to be a ton. Well, I don't think it'll be a ton. We'll see what happens once I start that stage. But that's the goal with this piece, is to have that throwback to the Beetlejuice character a bit more than the photo itself was. And then her dress, of course, are the black and white stripes. And I cannot wait for that section of Patreon, because I really want to talk about, or of that video next week, because I really want to talk about getting clothing to look like clothing. And even when you're working with something that's just black and white, I've got a really cool Lightroom tip for you on how to see things that are overexposed in the photo. So that will come next week. See how I blended everything out, but I had a lot of those brush strokes. So now I'm going over everything and just smoothing that out a bit more. Now when you spray with the texture fixative, it has a tendency to spit. Even at the best of times, nozzle's clean, brand new, everything, it still has a tendency to spit that inevitably, sooner or later, is going to happen to you. Does not ruin anything. It looks scary at the time, like, oh my god, I just ruined that layer. You're going to go on top of it and it will blend out completely. You'll never know that that happened. See there, if you look where I just pointed, that area is way too heavy. It won't even matter. Once this is dry, when I do the next layer, it will be completely blended out. There's another spot where it came out too heavy. Now, what I did in this case, I did not, I had shaken the can really well before the live stream, but I didn't clean the nozzle and I should have. So my nozzle was definitely clogged. I did figure out though, and I think it was during this stream, that if I only push the nozzle about halfway, don't push it all the way so the pressure was a little bit less, that it didn't spit almost at all. It made a really big difference. And I've only tried that on one can, so it's not the biggest sample size, but I thought that was pretty interesting. It definitely reduced the amount of spitting that occurred. But I mean, not that spitting's a huge deal. It's annoying when it happens on a layer where you think you're mostly done, but it's a quick and easy fix if that ever did happen to you on one of the final layers. But it did help. Now, as I've been working with this can over the last few days, I did not clean, I still haven't cleaned the nozzle, and it has gotten to the point where the pushing the nozzle halfway down, not working for me. So it's still spitting every single time I use it. So I need to remove the cap. You just pull the nozzle off the can, throw it in a sink full of hot water or a glass of hot water or whatever, and let it set well, I let it set until I forget about it and then go pick it up and the water's cooled down, but let it set for a bit and then let it dry off all the way, and that will make a big difference. But like I said, with this product, you're going to have times that it's going to spit. That's just what it does. It doesn't really hurt anything though, because the next layer will completely fix it. Now, those areas where it spit, if I don't let that dry completely, when I go over it with the pencil, sometimes it'll cause it to almost flake up and expose the paper underneath. It's minor, but you may notice these little flaky things that kind of lift, these little spots where the paper is showing through. That's usually what happened. It's that came out heavier and I didn't let it dry all the way. But it'll get hidden again in the next layer, so I'm still not ruining anything. But you could leave it if you wanted to leave something that's a little bit more rough. I mean, even right now, the texture for that background, I could have left it like this as a soft gray. That would have worked with a portrait. But, I mean, well, it'd look better if I got a little bit darker around the edges. But, I mean, you can stop there. You can stop at any point you want. You can make it as smooth as you want, or go ahead and leave it a little bit more rough like what it is now. One of the things that's kind of fun for me, the two mediums that are my absolute favorite to do portraits, well, I would say three because I would add graphite to that list, but colored pencil and oil paint. The thing that I like so much about colored pencil for portraits is that there is no rush. I can stop here, take a break, come back later. You won't even be able to tell that I blended it differently. With oil paint, if it starts to dry, you can get a little bit of weirdness there. So I really do like that aspect of, and the same thing with graphite, that you can kind of stop at any point. You don't feel as rushed to get something done before, not that oil paint dries fast, but I mean, you've got that dry time where either you're waiting for it to dry or you're trying to get a certain amount done so that it dries, before it dries overnight, depending on which mixing medium you're using. Some will dry overnight, some may stay wet for weeks, but you're never fighting that dry time with colored pencil. That is one thing that I really like about it. It is more time consuming, but certain aspects I think are way easier too with colored pencil, like the hair. At least on sanded paper with the powder blender, that hair was so easy to get those strokes and have it look realistic. And at this point in this video, you're still not getting the little wisps. I will add those later and it'll look even way more realistic. I don't have the little ones until I get everything else, her clothing and her skin blended in. But I really like powder blender. It's definitely, I mean, I like colored pencil in general, but powder blender and on sanded paper, even without powder blender, sanded paper where you can get those strokes, like every pencil stroke really shows, but still blends out really well. It is such a good combination for portraits, and especially for hair, for fur, anything like that. If that's something with colored pencil that you have struggled with, with this is definitely easier. I mean, okay, you would still have that learning curve. So if you think, I should throw this warning out, if you're new to powder blender, there is a huge learning curve where you're basically working with a completely different medium, even though you're using your colored pencils. You've got to learn how to layer and blend it properly. And it took me about, I would say, 3 full pieces before I felt confident with it. It took me a little bit longer than usual when I pick up a new medium. I mean, because I expected it to do, and I think that's why it took me longer. I expected it right off the bat to do what my other colored pencils did. I mean, I pretty much accomplished everything. I don't want to use the word master. I always hate saying I've mastered anything, but I mean, I understand how to make colored pencils do what I want. And so when I started using powder blender, that was a little frustrating. But once I got the hang of it, about 3 pieces in or so, I love it for fur and hair. It is the easiest medium I've used to get hair and fur to look right. Because even with graphite, when you want to put those light white lines on top, those little ones, that isn't easy to do with regular colored pencil on watercolor paper. Not really easy to get those highlights in, but on powder or on sanded paper, there's so much tooth that every pencil stroke shows. So getting those little wisps, getting all those little things, it is so easy to accomplish. I sound like I'm making this giant sales pitch. I'm not affiliated. I mean, I'm friends with the person who invented powder blender, but I don't get a commission. I'm not affiliated otherwise with them. I just get super excited because it's just a good product. I actually became friends with Aliona, the person who invented this. I've been a huge fan of hers for years, and I became friends with her through the process of me learning how to use this because I had so many questions, so we started talking all the time. Really nice lady. Very funny lady, actually. And just building up the darkness here. You can make anything as dark or light as you want. When I did use this the first time, this product, I did it on sand or on gessoed paper that I had taken, gessoed and let dry. I airbrushed gesso on it. And I really struggled to get my blue. I never did get it as dark as I wanted on that piece. I wasn't spraying often enough. And I think that's a problem that I've heard a lot of people who are using this product have early on, is that they end up not spraying at the right times or not really knowing when to spray. I thought I needed to take it outdoors every time I sprayed, so I would try to get a full, lots of layers in and then go spray. I wasn't spraying enough and I was making it more difficult for myself. Spraying with this, you can spray it indoors. It's really no more harsh than aerosol hairspray. So it's not like spraying a varnish where it's super, super strong and it feels like you're going to be knocked out if you spray it indoors. Definitely not the case with this stuff. Now, a big thing you want to watch for when you are using powder blender, don't push hard with that pencil. You can push hard later on, but if you want something to blend out smoothly, don't push hard at those layers. I mean, yeah, I can bring the tooth back to the paper, but the problem is if you push really hard with a pencil, it's like the lead or pigment, it sticks too much to the paper, so it doesn't really blend out very well on areas. I found this there every once in a while I won't be paying attention. I'll push too hard. No, even if though I plan to blend it out, and it's a little bit harder to cover. I have to put several coats of the texture fixative and then blend a few more layers on top to really get rid of those marks that I pushed too hard. So keep a very light hand with this. The other thing is you want to use oil-based pencils. So the two that I like the best for powder blender, I've only tried it once and it seemed like it worked okay with the Derwent Pro colors. But besides that, the Faber-Castell Polychromos are absolutely wonderful. They work so well with this. So, and I do use my wax-based pencils still with Powder Blender, but it's not with the Powder Blender product. I use it for my final layers. So layers that I don't plan to blend out. Because what happens with the wax-based pencils is that the wax makes it stick too much to the paper in a way that doesn't allow the Powder Blender to blend it out. Whereas the oil-based, they just stay nice and soft. And every time you see me stop there, that's basically where I'm reloading a little bit more powder blender on the brush. But you don't need it soaked in the stuff. Or caked in the stuff, I guess would be a better word. Because the pencils do just naturally want to blend out pretty well on sanded paper already. This is just aiding that and letting it happen even better. What powder blender is, or how Aliona described it to me, was it was a type of lubricant to let the pencil just slide through or kind of glide around a lot better. Before anyone asks, no, I don't know what the actual ingredients are or how she did this. I know there was a chemistry lab involved. Not her, she hired a company. I've had a few people ask if they can just use different sorts of powder. I've had questions about. No, it's not the same. And actually, she said she tried those too. It's not the same. We'll speed this up a bit because it really is just the same process again and again and again. I'm just repeating it over and over. Occasionally, I will add on some of this side here that I'm working on. I ended up adding some white pencil on some of the layers, or actually, it wasn't even white, it was a light gray color. You will see at one point, though, I'm going to add the powder blender titanium white. I'll use a clean sponge and or a clean soft tool and apply it directly to the side that I want to be lighter. So that's something that you can do with that product. You see me use it all the time when I mix it with touch-up texture to paint white highlights and details that way when I'm working on without powder blender on just watercolor paper. Here I'm going to end up doing it, I'm just going to apply it almost like you would with pastels or with pan pastels where you're applying it directly to the paper to lighten certain areas up. It takes a little getting used to because it has a tendency to want to stick a bit more. So I found it works best if I put a bit of powder blender down first and then that product on top. It seems to blend out softer. And I've switched where I'm starting to add more black when I get down to the bottom edges here. And you can see on my finished piece how much darker that really is. Well, sort of finished piece. I'm used to calling that the finished piece. It's clearly not the finished piece, but this portion was pretty much done. And for this one, to get the image onto the paper, I used a projector, a digital projector. I have one by Artograph. There, I want to say it was an 800 series. That one, I don't know if you can still get anymore, but a decent digital projector. I know it's actually made by LG. It's the same one, it just has different software in it. But a projector is the way that I get my image onto the paper. With sanded paper, you can also use transfer paper. Normally I don't like tracing in transfer paper with colored pencil because it's hard to cover those lines all the way. I'd rather use graphite where I can use a really light hand. But when you're working on sanded paper and with powder blender, it doesn't matter if you have a dark line, as you can see here. Those will all completely blend out. So tracing in transfer paper would be the other method. If you don't have a projector, that would be the way that I would go. I do not recommend freehanding directly on the paper because it doesn't erase. I mean, the lines erase a little bit, but you mostly just end up smudging things out. So like, even if you're somebody who doesn't like to trace things, if you want to freehand it, that's fine. But freehand it on another piece of paper that's the same size as the sanded paper you're going to project it onto. So that way you can have all your eraser marks, all the smudges, all the corrections are done there. Then take a piece of tracing paper, trace it, and then use transfer paper to transfer it onto this. And that will keep everything nice and clean and you don't have a million eraser marks. Now, if you do have eraser marks, it's not that you can't cover them, it's that you're not really going to be able to see easily what goes where. You have too many lines. You want to try to keep things a bit more clean so you can see. I mean, if I erased the eye and redid it so many times, I would just have a black smudge there by the end. I wouldn't really have erased things all the way. So drawing it on another piece of paper, tracing it, and then transferring it, or just, the projector. Those are the ways that I use. Now, this thing here is really cool. It's a little air thing, and I'll put a link in the description. But this thing, I got it on Amazon for, I don't know, I want to say $10 or $12. And it blows air. You just squeeze it and it gets all of the dust off of this. And you do have dust, like the remnants of the pencil as you're working here. Not as much as with pastels, but you still will have dust fallout. And so with that little squeezy air thing, it's amazing because I don't have to sit there and blow on my piece. And I cannot tell you many times I've blown on the piece to get rid of that and I end up spitting all over it, which I don't know, that just doesn't seem like the wisest choice. So with this, I don't have to sit there and blow to get the dust off. I can just squeeze the little thing and it is amazing. So whether you're working with pastels or with this, it is something that I really recommend. I mean, even with graphite, it's one of those things that I'm going to be using for any time that I would normally need to like blow eraser marks away or something like that, this tool is just so handy. So now we're on to another layer. So I must have been, I didn't count, but we're probably 5 layers in and then an additional 6. So I probably did anywhere, I would say between maybe 11 and 13 layers total to get that background. And you may think, wow, that is time consuming. Not that much. I think I spent more time waiting for my texture fixative to dry than I did actually working, because each of these layers, as you saw earlier on, they go fast. It is not very time consuming at all, especially when I'm not live streaming where I'm sitting there chatting, because I have a tendency to talk with my hands. So that means I stop working, but it goes very quickly. Now you will feel like you're burning through your pencils really, really fast. Mostly when you're, anytime you're working on sanded paper, but the majority of that is because you're filling in a large space really quick. You've got so much coverage there. So like I said, you will have some of that dust fallout, but it's again not like nothing like pastels, but it's the majority of the reason you're going through that pencil so fast is you're just getting so much coverage so quickly. Plus, if you're like me, I tend to work larger when I'm using the powder blender because it's so fast to fill 16 by 20. I don't normally fill in that much a project that big, not when I'm using the colored pencil as the background. I might work 16 by 20 if I'm going to airbrush the background and just use the pencils for the subject, but not for something like this. So this did use a lot of pencil. I went through, I think, a couple of gray pencils and I'd say maybe half a black pencil. But I would expect to do about the same to get this level of coverage on, even if I was using OMS on watercolor paper. It just would have taken a lot longer. So there's where I'm adding that titanium white. And parts you can see that's sticking a little bit more. That is happening because I didn't put the powder blender down first. If you put a bit of that, that helps it to glide a bit smoother. Mine's kind of sticking a bit there. I think mine was sticking a bit too because it was so humid when I was working on this stage and I had my window open, or the sliding glass door open, so it was probably not helping matters. So blending over that. Actually, we'll smooth a lot of that out just with, there's that air blower thing, technical term there. I'll smooth out a lot of the white smudges there with the pencil. So spraying that, let it dry, and then this is where I had come through and did another 6 layers. I actually counted those so I could tell you guys how many more layers it took for me to get it this smooth, and I just repeated that process again and again, and it's same exact process, where I started using more grays, the lighter grays on the left or the right side, fading into the same dark grays I was originally using, and just blending until I got it to the smooth. Wow, that is not, I can't say that, smoothness that I wanted. So now the gray hair, I don't know where the video footage went for that. Not really important because that's not the finished hair there. We'll come back to that later. But let's go ahead and start with the color portions of the hair. So if you notice my drawing, I don't have a ton of detail there. What I've drawn out are my main clumps and clusters of the hair. I'm probably going to call this fur so many times. I'm already having to catch myself. I draw animals too much. But I'm drawing the clumps and clusters. Where are the lights? Where are the darks? And that's what I'm focusing on. I just picked a brown. I don't know that any of these browns are the exact color I needed. It doesn't really matter. I can do what's essentially a glaze on later layers and correct color very, very easily. What I'm most focused on right now, I mean, she has brown hair, has a warm tone to it, so I'll use some of the kind of orangey, neutral brownish gold colors, not yellow. I can't stress that part enough. Not yellow. Do not use yellow in the hair. Use, there's a pumpkin orange color that I use. Those colors are fine, but don't use yellow in hair. Even if the person has blonde hair, use grays, creams, purples, not yellow. Anyway, moving on. So as I go into this, I'm going to use brown. I'm going to use the Caput Mortem color, and I will use black and cream. Now with Polychromos, I don't like their cream and their white pencil. They are super translucent, except with this and on sanded paper. On sanded paper, oh my gosh, they show up so well. But the highlights, I'm not going to use white for. I'll just use my cream pencil. But even that, I will do it, like I said, as a glaze, and you'll see that in a few minutes here. But I will go back over that with colors. So the highlights will still be there, but not, cream. So there's that orangey tone that I was talking about. And it's still a very neutral tone. It's not, bright rainbow orange. And one of the things that people get so hung up on portraits, well, especially with the skin tones, but even with the hair, what colors? I need to know the exact colors. No, grab a color, try it. If it doesn't look right, grab another one. It's the values. Always, it's the values. It is not the color. That is what you're going to focus on. I mean, no matter what hair color I use, I'm usually using the same set of pencils, just the browns. I grab the browns, usually the warmer browns, although on here I used some of the more gray kind of cool browns too. I will usually use caput mortuum, even at blonde hair, dark hair. I use that on almost all parts of the portrait. But and then of course the black for the shadows here. Now if it were blonde hair, you're usually not going to jump to black for shadows. There may be times that you use it. Jump to purple for your shadows or magentas. Try that first, or even darker browns. But try to avoid jumping straight to black when you're going with blonde hair. Depending on how light that blonde hair is, it can be a little bit much. You may need it, just don't jump there first. Here, with her hair being a bit darker, I can safely use black for my darker bits. Again, this was a part of the live stream, but the live stream makes everything look smoother than what it really is. So this will give you a better idea. We can focus more on specifically the hair, not just the general live stream Q&A. And apparently take a lot of breaks because I talk so much on those. Now, when you do hair, when you're drawing hair, don't look at it as hair. Like, try to get that out of your head as much as possible and look at it as abstract shapes. So, okay, her hair being wavy, this is a really good example. A lot of people want to draw hair like it's coming out of the scalp, one long strand, and have it go around the side of the head and all the way down and do this, just a bunch of strands like that. You will create what looks like a zombie that way. Not very realistic looking zombie at that. Like, it'll look stringy. Here, her hair is curled. It starts and stops in random areas where this clump of hair folds over that clump of hair. You have a lot of twisting and turning, and that is what you want to watch for on that reference photo. Watch closely on that reference photo. Turn it upside down if you need to. That will make everything, it'll feel like it's harder, but it'll actually make your work more accurate and make it much easier once you get the hang of it. But it will feel harder at first. Everyone always fights that because your brain's like, wait, what did you just do? I understood what I was doing before, when it really didn't. So flipping it upside down will really help. And you want to make sure you flip your reference photo over too. Both should be upside down. But it forces you to see the abstract shapes that you really want to see when you're looking at hair. Like I said, it's not just one strand start to finish. And especially here where it's curly, people want to do like little loop-de-loos or things like that. No, they're clumps and clusters. They're little shapes where it's skinny at each end, it gets wider, and then thins out again. And then the way that they twist and turn, you really want to watch where those highlights are, because you don't want to just put highlights randomly everywhere. That's another mistake that a lot of people will make. Oh, it's hair, just throw some highlights. I see that a lot in pet portraits too. Throw some highlights. Well, no, the highlights determine in an animal the underlying bone and muscular structure, but in her, with her hair being curly, that's what makes it look like it's curly, where areas are coming out, because that's where the light is hitting. So you really want to watch that reference photo. Don't just make it up where as you go along. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to copy every strand exactly either. That's a big thing. When I first started drawing, I felt like that, like it has to all be exact. It doesn't. It absolutely does not. I need the hair to go in the right direction. I need to make sure that it's got highlights in the right area, the lights and the darks. Color does not have to be exact. It has to be close. But I mean, if it's a little bit off, that's not that big of a deal. It's the values. Get your darks dark enough, your lights light enough. That's what's going to make it look realistic. But watch the shape. Watch where it curves, how you create your strands. Now, these early layers, not a big deal. These do not have to be, I don't really have to worry about my pencil strokes too much, which direction they're going in, because this is all going to get blended out into basically one solid mass. Now, you might look at this and go, okay, why don't I just shade it all in brown so I've got this nice base layer on everything, and then I'll put everything on top? Well, then I would lose all of those lines I previously drew in, so that actually makes more work for me. So instead here, even though I'm going to blend it out, I still want to blend each section or work on each section a bit separately, and that's going to help me to keep them separate, keep my place as I'm working, because it is so easy when you're working on hair to just come, even if it's short hair, like really short hair, you can lose your place so easily. And if one or two strands, if some of the strands aren't the same, no one's really going to know the difference. That's not a huge deal as long as you're close. You have a bit more freedom or flexibility on how accurate you are with the hair than you do once you get into the face. Once you get into the face, I mean, I can adjust the values, which I will. I'm going to hype up the contrast a bit, oversaturate some of the colors to get myself a little bit more three dimension. But in the hair, besides that, the drawing has to be very accurate. With the hair, it just needs to be pretty close. It's not as big of a deal as the drawing being accurate in the face. If the curl's a little off, no one will notice. If the nose is a little off, everyone's going to notice. And even on these first layers, I'm even less accurate than what I'm going to be. I will basically, every layer in between each layer, and I spray it and then go on to the next layer. As I move on each additional layer, I tighten up a bit more and a bit more and a bit more and get it closer and closer to what I want that end result to be. These earlier layers, I'm a bit looser. It's not, like I said, it's just not a huge deal that everything be perfect, but I do want to keep a general, idea of where my place is. I used quite a bit of variation in the colors, so don't think this has to be the exact, but just to give you an idea of what I used here, for the majority of these, I used Beastray, and these are all with polychromos again. So Beastray, Burnt Ochre, and this is the one that I call that kind of pumpkin orange. It's just this really neutral. It has an orangey tint to it, a very warm tint without being like, rainbow orange. I used Burnt Sienna quite a bit on this. I used Van Dyke Brown, of course, black, like I mentioned, and that's Van Dyke Brown again, and then, of course, cream. But that isn't necessarily something that I would look at and go, these are the exact colors you have to use to make it look like this. You could use different colors, but if you got your values right, even if the colors, if it was a different shade of brown, a different shade of that, but still close, it's still going to look realistic. I mean, the color, the ochre colors, I wasn't even expecting those to work. I thought that they were going to be too light, too orangey. So I was kind of surprised. I was just looking to build up my values, and they ended up being something that I used on the later layers too. They worked out really well. If you have a mantra going through your head as you work on your hair, on any hair, clumps and clusters. Just remember that, clumps and clusters. Don't focus so much on individual strands. Now, even here, I'm working that pencil in the direction that the hair is going to go. It's honestly kind of unnecessary at this point. You can just fill it in quickly, more solidly. And I'm not going to worry about the detail where her hair meets her skin or around her face, or any, whether it be a loose strand or just the actual hairline. That I have to wait until the skin is put in, and then I will come back with the hair and fix some of that. And even here, the hair isn't quite the right shape. I had to reform some of that a bit, when I got up to her forehead. But it was very easy to do. I think powder blender, one of the things that's so nice too, or I should even just sanded paper, the way that you're going to layer and how many layers you're able to get, I feel even more free than on watercolor paper with choosing colors, because I can so easily hide it and change it. I don't even test on a separate piece of paper when I'm working on sanded paper, because if I don't like it, it is just so easy to go over with another color and not be able to see the color I didn't like at all. Normally, when I work in colored pencil, I like to have a scrap piece. Bleh, that didn't come out right at all. Scrap piece of paper near me so that I can get a general idea of what certain colors when I layer them if I'm not sure. But I don't do that with powder blender. Now see how much fall off from the pencil, like where I had done the gray of her hair. Look at the fall off where her face is all smudged and gray and things are just a mess everywhere. It doesn't matter if that happens to yours. Doesn't matter at all. None of that is going to show once I go over it with a pencil. If I had a super dark black smudge or something like that, I would of course try to erase it, but it really isn't going to make a big deal. Make a big deal? Make a problem. Make my grammar. I'm recording this at 11 at night, and apparently my grammar is just not working well. I think it went to bed. You can see, look at that pencil, how dull the tip is. That's what I mean. You don't need it sharp. It won't matter in the end. Here's another common question with powder blender is when you use the texture fixative spray, do you need to protect the surface? I mean, I kept spraying again and again and again over the background. That means that spray is getting all over her face. Am I ruining anything? Do I need to block that or protect that? Not at all. It doesn't seem to affect anything one way or another when the spray gets on an area that you don't have pencil on. Or like where when I start spraying her face or her hair, I'm going to start getting this spray on the background where I am pretty much finished. It still doesn't hurt it unless it starts to spit. If it starts to spit, then I'm just going to go over it with a loose layer on top just to soften that out. But it would just be a quick layer. It wouldn't be like a full layer like my other layers were just enough to soften out anywhere where I might accidentally get a bit of spitting from that can. Speed this up a bit so you can see a bit better how this is coming together and being formed. So now here you can see that black pencil, using that quite a bit to start getting these shadows in. And even for black hair, not black hair, for brown hair, you may not always want to jump to black either. It depends on what the lighting is. There are times where you wouldn't even need black, depending, it completely depends on the lighting of whatever specific situation. One of the things that a lot of people will do with portraits is they look for this one answer to everything. Well, what color to use for brown hair? What color to use for blonde hair? I can give you the colors that I use for one lighting situation. I change that lighting situation, and this different lighting situation may call for blue in the hair that didn't in the other. There's no one answer, and that comes to skin tone. You can have the same person in three different lighting situations, and I'm going to use three different sets of pencils. Certain pencils will be usually the same, but I mean, for the most part, I'm going to adjust a lot of that. Worry about your values more than anything. Whenever you find people who are like, these are the colors you use for skin tones, I've seen online guides like that. And honestly, while yes, it's giving the people what they want, I also don't think it's that helpful, because it's going to make every single one of your portraits look the same no matter the lighting if you think those are always the colors you're going to use for one thing. But you've got to keep in mind the same person, the same hair, the same whatever in different lighting situations is going to create a completely different situation. Totally different colors. So, I mean, if she had the sun hitting her a certain way, I probably wouldn't use any black for her color of hair. Her hair is actually not a super dark brown. So this is that tiny tool I was talking about that comes with the powder blender kit if you get it directly from Aliona's site. Little like eyeshadow brush there. So see how now I can see my general clumps and clusters vaguely. I mean, somebody who hadn't seen or didn't have the reference photo wouldn't really know. It would just look flat to them. But for me, for you guys at that stage, you can still see where your general lines are going to go. I'm blending each one out separately. I'm not just scribbling all over side to side like I did with the background where it's all done at once because I don't want it to be that solid. And I will spray that stage with the texture fixative, let it dry, and I can go ahead and go on to the next. And this is the same thing. Every single layer, I get a little bit closer, tighten it up a little bit more. Each one gets closer to that end result. So when you get to this stage, don't think just because you have pencil or paint on something that that area is done. It is not. You do glazes, lots of layers. That's going to make things look way better. So now this stage, it does start to get a bit more important to start letting these pencil lines show. And I will start pushing harder with a pencil too, because that's going to make it so that those layers don't blend out that well, which is good. I don't necessarily want them to blend out that well. I'm covering the base of the paper. It doesn't look gritty or grainy to me at that stage. So I'm perfectly fine to go ahead and start pushing harder if I need to. Where knowing that those layers won't blend well because like I was explaining earlier, if you push too hard, it kind of sticks to the paper too much. I could even start introducing wax pencils at this stage if I want. Now, the hair, what you're seeing on the finished photo, not technically done, even on the parts that look done. I mean, it's not just the wisps that I'm going to pull back in. I'm going to pull a few highlights and a little bit of glazing with some wax-based pencils on top of this once I get everything else finished. And that won't happen in today's video. You'll see that next week. At this stage, I'm just using my black pencil and putting in where all of the shadows are going to go. And I am, like I said, starting to worry about the direction of those pencil strokes. This stage, it does start to matter more. You can almost think of the hair, it's almost like these plates of, or folds of fabric or ribbon or something like that at this stage where pay attention where the lights and the darks go because this is actually very similar to how I draw, let's say, curtains or fabric, or when I did the American flag, same thing where it folds. That's what I'm doing with the hair. I'm just letting it be a bit streakier, but it's those clumps. It's connected in almost one piece. Don't try to think of hair as thousands and thousands and thousands of individual hairs. Try to think of it more in these bigger plates, bigger clumps. And I know I've said that a million times in this video already, and hear me say it every time I draw hair, but it's the biggest thing that you really want to get in your head. And the pauses that you're seeing me take here, This is just because of the live stream. Again, I don't think that you need to take these, like, it's not that slow. This is much faster to work in. Even though I have it sped up a bit, it's still much, much faster. In person, you can block that hair out so quickly, even though it's a large space. Normally, I say the videos give you the illusion that things are going faster than they really are. This is actually kind of the opposite. This makes things feel like it takes so much longer than it really did if I'm not talking in the live stream and actually just focusing and working. Luckily, next week when we get onto the face, you won't have to deal with that. And if you find yourself really struggling with hair, try doing just some studies of only hair. Don't even, draw the general outline of the head so you know where it would go. But don't even worry about the face. Practice drawing the hair. Anytime you're struggling with any element, let's say you feel like I'm really good at hands, or at faces, but I suck at hands. Then that's the thing you want to spend more time doing, just studies of just hands until you feel like you've got a really good grasp of drawing hands, of shading them accurately, of getting all of that right. If you struggle with hair, practice that. If you struggle with eyebrows, because eyebrows are actually a little bit more difficult to make look realistic than a lot of people realize. You can easily end up looking like they were done with a Sharpie marker. So practice any area. Lips, if you feel like lips are a struggle for you, do something where you're only full piece start to finish, all you are going to do are the lips, the whatever area that you're struggling with. Fabric, clothing, just zoom in and do a study of a piece of, like, a shirt, the way that the folds lie. Anything that you feel that's a weak spot for you, and especially if it's a weak spot that you find yourself avoiding. You'll see a reference photo, you think, this is gorgeous, I want to use this. Or you take a photo of yourself, this is gorgeous, I want to do this. Oh, but that has that area, that thing I struggle with, that thing I'm not, the hands, the feet, whatever. That is a pretty good indication to you that you need to do some studies just on that thing over and over and over again until you get confident with them, to where you never stray away from doing a certain reference photo that you would otherwise be interested in because it has that one thing that's just too hard for you. There's nothing, I mean, if you can learn to do the face, if you can learn to do any element, you can learn to do the rest. I think what happens with the face too is it's something that we just tend to be more interested in, so we want to spend all of the time with that. We get the eyes, and everything looks so good, especially the eyes, which is probably one of the easier parts, but we get that done, and then it comes to the hair or to the hands, and we're just like, meh, I'm not going to take it that. We'll just go through this quickly. Ears. Oh my gosh, that is a big one you want to practice with. That is something that I see artists all the time. Their face looks amazing and they get to the ears and it's just like, I mean, I can tell an ear would be there. It doesn't necessarily, like, it doesn't look as good as the rest of the portrait. You want to make sure your portrait, every element looks just as good as every other element, because if you have something like that, whether it be a pet portrait, a person, whatever, where one thing you're not super good with, that you've not taken the time to really put the effort into it like you did every other area of the piece, it'll pull the entire piece down. It does matter. You may think it's an ear, it's not that big of a deal. No, it is. It really is. While, yeah, that's not where you want the focus to be. It's not where you want people to, like, first, oh my gosh, walk up to your painting and say, wow, that's such an awesome ear. That's not going to happen. But if the ear isn't awesome, that's when it's noticeable. Hands are a big thing. I used to spend a lot of time just practicing drawing hands. I would just sit there both in front of a mirror with my own hand, and this is before digital cameras were a thing. Like, it was hard to find good reference photos back then. No internet. But I would sit there and just draw my own hand, try to hold it in place as much as possible, and just practice drawing that over and over. And the nice thing is, that's a reference you've always got with you. So here's where I'm going to come through with that cream pencil, and look at how this shows up. Like, I mean, you can see every pencil stroke. So this gives you an idea. When I go through with the wisps later on, they're going to show up really easily, where much more so than they would have with if I were working on my hot press watercolor paper or Stonehenge or anything else. I mean, yeah, you can get this look with those papers, but it is so like, I feel like I'm cheating. It's so easy to do with this. And while I'm not going to leave it cream, this is good for a highlight. And then when I spray over it and put another color on top, that other color is going to stand out more because it's on top of a more opaque, lighter color. It's kind of the same concept that you've seen me talk about before. Like, let's say you're painting an ocean scene and you paint, this would be with paint, not with pencils, but you paint the blue background and you want a clownfish. You can't just paint the orange on top of the dark blue of the clownfish, of the dark blue water behind it. That orange is going to be too translucent. It won't be bright. You've got to paint it white or something opaque, like either titanium white or unbleached titanium white, something opaque, and then you put the orange on top, which is, again, the orange is translucent. But now it's going to be bright and bold because it's up against this light color. And that's the same thing that I'm doing here. I'm taking this light color, and while I'm not going to leave it this color, when I put the oranges, those lighter colors, they're going to pop that much more because I've got a light opaque color underneath it over the brown. Like how that cream, even over that dark gray, how much that stands up. And that dark gray, too, is an area where I have burnished the paper. It's lost a lot of the tooth, but it still shows up so well. Now, this pencil, if you were working on watercolor paper, I don't like it at all. I almost never use it. It doesn't show up very well. Same thing with polychromos white. In that case, if I want a white to show up, I'm going to switch to my wax-based pencil. So in my case, the Luminance or the Derwent drawing pencils. Those show up much, much better than the polychromos. This is the Caput Mortem color, and look at this nice rich color it gives me, because the color that I have is a little bit like dusty looking. Her hair just looks dusty and dirty and not really rich in color. But by adding this color, the Caput Mortem, over that, and then again I'll come back with those ochre colors, look at how rich that looks. Again, working it in the direction of the hair, so it looks like I've got all these individual strands, but it's just a few pencil strokes. Really simple. And this little curl at the bottom is going to look like too much of a solid mass, this whole area, until I get the clothing in where I can have all the wisps sticking out. It's going to look too solid. Those few individual strands really do matter. So where I talk all the time, like hair isn't a bunch of individual strands. No, but you do need a few in order to make it look realistic, depending on the texture of the person's hair. You've got to find a balance in creating hair texture between what should be super soft and blended and overlapping each other versus where you want those individual strands. Too much of one or the other, and you end up with something that can look very plastic and fake or very stringy. And colored pencil especially, I think, can be a bit of a challenge for a lot of people to make it look like hair and not like plastic. And a lot of that comes to the way that you blend those base layers. You've got to overlap, you've got to layer, you've got to blend. And that's true whether you're working on watercolor paper, Stonehenge, or sanded paper. Or in paint. I mean, if you do a paint by number, it doesn't look like soft hair. Or, that paint by number, just put the right color in the right place style. And this whole chunk will look a little bit weird too until I get the clothing in and can get all those individual strands. See how this lighter color just layers and blends into it. And when I get to my final layers, I don't always blend with the blending tool. Sometimes I blend with my fingers on this. It does get, and it doesn't feel super dry and chalky where it freaks me out. Like you guys know, I hate the feel of pastels, but I don't find that to be the case here when I just use the tips of my fingers for blending some of this. I wouldn't do it for large areas because it is sandpaper. You're going to file down your skin, but for little areas here and there, it works really well. You can get an even softer look than what you can with some of the blending tools. And when I use my fingers, I don't put powder blender on my fingers. I mean, it's not toxic. It's not going to hurt if it gets on there. But I use what's already been blended. I'll have like blended here and then go back over it with my fingers. So this is being blended here with powder blender on that brush or sponge. And I'm not over blending this because I'm letting some of those strokes or those pencil strokes stay. And of course I'll add more on top. Okay, that one I over blended. But it doesn't hurt anything. I'll go back over it. But I don't need to blend this super, super smooth as I'm apparently overdoing here. So now that is a stage that everything's too soft. It looks like she just brushed her hair. It doesn't have a very natural feel. So I wouldn't want to stop here. And you might be tempted to. Don't. Look closer at that reference photo. I mean, look even here at the semi-finished stage, how much better that looks when I come back through and put more pencil strokes on top. One of the biggest problems that a lot of artists have is knowing when something is finished. A lot of people, for the critiques especially, they submit things and it's not that it's bad, it's just not finished. There's nothing wrong with it. They just didn't finish it. They called it finished maybe a quarter of the way through instead of, all four quarters. Using my little blow thing, blowing the dust off. Then I'll go ahead and spray this. And so now as I go over the areas that I had the cream, look how much more that will stand. Well, apparently I wasn't light enough, but it'll stand out so much more now when I go on top with the ochre. More with the black, really darkening some of this up. I want to create the depth, that dimension, and if I don't have my darks dark enough or my lights light enough, it'll look flat. So pay attention where, like here, I wanted that sharp edge, and then I pull it out into that clump of hair, but leave the harsh edge with the one right above it. A lot with art has to do with learning where you're going to want a harsh line versus a very soft line. So pay attention to your reference photo. When you look at an area that's light or dark, what's harsh, what's sharp? Or no, those are the same thing. What's harsh and sharp? What is soft? What needs to be blended into the next area? So here's an example of a harsh edge right up against her ear, and then see how it fades down into the next section. Definitely want to watch which direction these pencil strokes are going at this stage. And the reason that you can't just start with, getting all of those hair, the little individual sections and the strands like I'm doing here, I've got to get that solid base. I want to make sure that paper is covered underneath because these strands aren't going to cover everything. I think the big thing to notice here too is, I mean, you look at someone and you go, okay, it's brown hair. I'm gonna use a brown pencil. Look how many colors are in there to create brown hair and to make it look realistic, to make it look glossy. And even if you look here, those two clumps basically, or I guess kind of three little clusters right under her ear versus what's below that area. Look at how it goes from being kind of chalky and dusty versus looking super glossy by getting more layers, more colors. You will have random chunks that don't make any sense. You don't know why it connects to an area. It doesn't make, your brain can't really grasp it. Do it anyway. Copy that in the reference photo because it will all come together in the end. There are areas that seem like a random highlight when you're up close to it, and it's just, you look at it going, what? Look at it as abstract shapes. Copy the abstract shapes you see there and just trust that reference photo. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't make changes because you think it'll look better. But for the most part, really look at what you're seeing. Look at how it twists and turns and just trust that photo. There's that caput mortem color again. I can't think of many hair colors or situation where that is not a pencil I would use. I mean, I use it in pretty much anytime I use colored pencil, that is almost always used. It's just such a good color for so many things. Pushing quite a bit harder with a pencil on a lot of the this stage. You see, just get the highlight there. I don't need to go from shadow to highlight to shadow with that same highlight. Focus where that color goes based on that one section. So and here, the way the light is hitting, I only really needed it in the center there. You don't have to have every strand start to finish on any section you do. The strands appear and disappear under other strands all over the place. Don't feel like they have to connect and end somewhere, like maybe with a tree branch. When you're drawing a dormant tree, all of the branches obviously need to be touching something. That really isn't the case when you're working with hair like this. I mean, you don't want a random hair floating out of nowhere, but when you're working with the clumps and clusters, you're going to have them appear and disappear those strands. They don't have to start and end somewhere, or start and end where they look like they're connected, I mean. Now, a good idea is to put a piece of glassine under your hand as you're working. I am smudging things left and right here. Now, at this stage, I'm holding my hand up so it's not resting because I'm not doing a lot of fine detail. But it is a good idea to get glassine, and glassine works better than another piece of paper. Another, like regular paper, can smudge what's under it. You can use wax paper, but it's not as good. The glassine is better. It's acid free. I'm not sure if wax paper is or not, but I know with glassine, nothing's going to stick to it. So you're not as likely to have smudges or problems there. If you don't have that, a piece of tracing paper can work too, because that's also translucent or semi-translucent like the glassine, so you can see under your hand, which helps you to judge your values better and everything else. So just have something there. If you're going to rest your hand against the paper, put something under it. Here, my hand is not touching it. Now, earlier it was, and I did get some of the gray from the background on my hand, but here I'm holding the pencil where my hand is kind of away from it. It's not resting there. If you work upright like I do, you can also use a maul stick. Which is probably what I need to pull out for the rest of this painting now that I think about it. I've got one behind my easel somewhere. Then I don't need to use glassine because my hand would rest against the stick instead of the paper. Just slightly blending a little bit just to soften it up a bit. And this is pretty much where I'll leave it. I don't think at this point I went on any more than that, but I'm still going to come through and put a few individual strands on top of that later on with the wax-based pencils after everything else in the portrait is finished. But I just want to slightly soften that out, but not so much that I lose all of those brush strokes, or I say brush strokes, pencil strokes. I still want to see some of those individual strands. I guess I was going to put a few more strands in. And here you can see I'm pushing harder with that pencil. Those lines are not going to blend out too much. Got to make sure they go in the right direction then, because I can't just softly kind of erase them. Now, I could, of course, if I had a huge mistake, I could spray the texture fixative or even paint the touch-up texture, the stuff that comes in the little nail polish bottle that I mix with the titanium white to paint on highlights. I can paint that. That actually, the main intent of that product is to paint directly with a little nail polish brush, paint it directly on any area that needs more tooth, and then I can kind of start from scratch, building up again if I did have anything major go wrong that I really wanted to cover up and I lost the tooth. So you've got the touch-up texture spray that will bring back tooth, or the texture fixative. I'm sorry, the texture fixative is the spray that'll bring back more tooth, or that touch-up texture you can just paint on if it's a small spot where you don't need to spray a big area. Just a few strands. And again, I'm going to have to come back over this once I get the skin in. And you might think, well, why not do the skin first? Well, you can do either that you prefer. I prefer, you almost always in a portrait, you will see me do the hair first, because it's going to, in most cases, be one of the darkest portions of the portrait. If I'm working on a portrait, I start with the skin, I will almost always go too light on the skin. And that is a common problem with people when you're starting with portraits, is you feel it looks like it's too dark when in fact it is almost always too light. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've had critiques sent to me of white Will Smith because they did the skin tone, like they were afraid to go too dark. So start with dark. If you start with the hair, that is already such a dark area. You have your values blocked in. Yeah, I'm going to come through. I'm going to have to do details, but my main darks are there, and it makes it so much easier for me to get the correct skin tone when I start there. Every time that I've started with the face and then came back and added hair, I had to go back into the face and darken areas up quite a bit. So I find it just to be easier to go ahead and block that in, even if I want to come back and do the final details on the hair like you're seeing here. I'm not completely finishing it, but I still can easily do that, and it's going to make it much easier once I start the hair. Sometimes you can start with the clothing first. I usually don't. I usually do hair, skin, then clothing. That's just me. You can go any way you want, but you can. Yeah, I tried to dry. I oversprayed that. Look at how I've got those chunks. I'm gonna have to fix that. And then I decided to see if I could kind of pop the bubbles with air. That's what I'm doing with that. That's blendy guy or air blowy guy there. It kind of worked. I ended up using the hairdryer on it and just going over it a little bit with another layer where I oversprayed that. But you get a good idea of what I did there. But back to which order you do on the portraits. You do whatever makes you most comfortable. I've seen people do the skin first, the hair first. The other thing that I like doing, especially with powder blender, the hair first, is that it gets really dark and it kind of falls. You'll have a bit of the area, the product falling down, as you can see on her face here. Because I haven't done her face yet, it doesn't matter. I'm not worrying about smudging a dark area on accident or anything like that. It really doesn't matter. The thing is, I'm just going to have to come back through. Once I get the skin in, I've got to come back through with that hair and just overlap the edges just a bit into the portrait portion. But that will all be next week's video.